Hi, everyone that's already joined. We're just waiting for the group to get together. Thanks for joining early. Well, thanks for joining. Just giving it a few more minutes for the registrants to join. Make yourself at ease. Grab some lunch if it's lunchtime. All right, thanks everyone for joining. I'm going to go ahead and get us started as more people join us as well. Welcome to our ecosystem event at the Skull World Forum. It's great to see so many of you here, and I'm really looking forward to this lunchtime conversation on innovation in education, if indeed it is like lunchtime where you are. My name is Alina Lipkin. I lead the work on innovation for impact at the Global Schools Forum. The Global Schools Forum is a community of non-state organizations that reaches 5 million underserved children across 51 low and middle income countries. The format of the session today is very simple. I'll start by setting the scene very briefly. We will do some introductions, and then I will invite our amazing panelists to a discussion, leaving time at the end for questions from you. If you have any questions over the course of the discussion, please submit them via the question and answers box, which is the one with the 2 bubbles. But we will also make room for live questions at the end, because we'd like to keep this as interactive as possible and hear from you as well. Um, First and foremost, I guess, why did we decide to get together today and talk about innovation? The latest report on learning recovery from UNICEF, UNESCO, and the World Bank shows that after the pandemic, the percentage of 10-year-olds who can't read a simple sentence in low and middle income countries has increased from 50 to 70%. And what that basically means is that the basic skills, the foundational skills upon which every aspect of education is built, have been erased in many countries. Children also lack the 21st century skills that are needed to secure decent livelihoods and employment. And the situation is quite stark, and the consequences on earnings and well-being will be felt the most by girls and the most marginalized children. We're here today because I think collectively we think we cannot solve this challenge with business as usual approaches in education, and that this new reality calls for experimentation, trying out new approaches with an open mind. We've also heard multiple high-level calls for more innovation and partnership in education. For example, the Global Education Monitoring Report on non-state actors in education calls for more partnerships between non-state actors and governments and fostering innovation ecosystems. A new UNESCO report on reimagining education essentially calls for a new social contract for education, one that allows for communities and for schools to be more directly involved in solving some of the education challenges. What is clearly kind of coming out in the education discourse globally and locally as well, is that we require a better set of tools throughout the education systems to align the incentives of schools, governments, and other funders on to nurture innovation for impact at scale. So we have today a panel of organizations and individuals with very diverse and unique perspectives on this topic. Individuals who work closely with schools at Schools 2030 and the Global Schools Forum, a former government advisor in Sierra Leone, a broker of innovative financing transactions from the British Asian Trust, and a funder perspective from the Jacobs Foundation. So I would like to first invite our panelists to introduce themselves. And let's go in alphabetical order as per the slide as well. So starting with Ellen, John, Kieran, Sadiq, and Wilsina.
Thanks very much, Alina, and I'm really pleased and honoured to be representing Schools 2030 today and joining the panellists. So my name's Ellen Smith. I'm the Global Research Coordinator at Schools 2030. To tell you a bit about the programme, Schools 2030 is a 10-year participatory learning improvement programme. We're based in 1,000 government schools across 10 different countries. And we use the principles of human-centred design and focus on the key transition years of students aged 5, 10 and 15 years old, and work with teachers to support them and their students to design and implement education micro-innovations. And in the long run, our hope is that these low-cost and scalable innovations will then inform education systems to improve holistic learning outcomes for marginalised learners around the world. I'll hand over to John.
Thanks, Ellen. Hi, everybody. Nice to be with you. I'm John Solyanikov. I'm the co-lead of Learning Schools at the Jacobs Foundation. We're a Swiss-based family foundation. We've been around for a bit over 30 years, focused on child and youth development. Our current strategy cycle has the theme of learner variability, where we try to promote systems that can adapt to the unique individual needs of learners. And we do that through 3 broad portfolios. One is our Learning Societies portfolio that has target countries of Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, Switzerland, and Colombia and Brazil. We look to do that through our Learning Minds portfolio, which is focused on promoting more and better research, supporting mid-career researchers, and awarding a research prize every year. And the Learning Schools portfolio, which I'm in charge of, which is trying to promote better sharing of best practices across borders and across education systems through a series of partners that we call school aggregators that engage with large numbers of schools. We see the school as a kind of not fully appreciated unit of educational change at the grassroots level. And we also look at the role of technology in education. That's both in the developed world as well as in the developing world. And the overall focus is trying to bring more evidence around what works and what doesn't work when it comes to technological innovations in the classroom. So with that, I don't recall who's next. I pass back to Alina.
Kieran.
Thanks, Alina. Thanks everyone for joining. Really excited to be a part of the panel today. I won't give you too much of a background on the Global Schools Forum because I think Alina's done an excellent job on that. But yes, I work with Alina in the impact and innovation team at the Global Schools Forum, and we are currently working on the Impact at Scale Labs, which is an initiative to support non-state actors within our community to scale interesting innovations. We do this over a 2.5-year period, supporting them with funding, guidance, and support around monitoring and evaluation. I won't go on too much, so I will let Sadiq introduce himself.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here today and part of the panel. So I'm Sadiq. I work in the social finance team at the British Asian Trust. So for those who might not be aware, British Asian Trust was founded by Prince Charles, and we're a diaspora-led organisation delivering impactful programs across South Asia. Our social finance work has been mainly on education and skilling in India, but we're also looking to do more in Pakistan and Bangladesh. So our role is as a broker or intermediary to bring together actors across different sectors around impact bonds and other kind of innovative financing programs. So in particular, my role is to think about how these kind of programs can lead to a longer term systemic change and a longer term impact. So one of the things that I'm doing now is looking at a large foundational literacy and numeracy program across a number of states in India, following kind of widespread learning losses that have occurred through COVID. Thanks. Over to you, Wilsina.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. I'm Wilsina Jallo from Sierra Leone. I worked with the Tony Blair Institute. I served as an advisor to the government of Sierra Leone. And during this time, I was embedded at the Directorate of Science, Technology, and Innovation to lead on setting up a human capital development incubator in the Office of the President. The incubator basically was designed to seed, test, and scale innovations to improve literacy and numeracy, reduce maternal mortality, and to attain food self-sufficiency. I'll be speaking about the education work through which we launched the Education Innovation Challenge and had 5 service providers implementing innovations around pedagogy, involvement of parents and community, school management, and the use of tablet devices to improve literacy and numeracy. Before TBI, I worked with the National Ebola Response Center and later the President Delivery Team. Over to you, Alina.
Thank you very much. Very much looking forward to hearing more from this amazing group. And to kick us off, I wanted to start with the first question that, I spoke a lot about these trends that we see globally, but it would be really nice to hear about what examples of innovation that help improve learning and equity you have seen come to life during the pandemic through your organization's work. And I want to start with Ellen.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Alina. So before I just dig right into some specific examples, just wanted to reiterate that Schools 2030 micro innovations are always focused on holistic learning. And for us, that's both academic and non-academic domains. And because we're working across a wide variety of different countries, we focus on a different set of holistic learning domains as defined by country teams in collaboration with many stakeholders to ensure that we're addressing the appropriate and contextualized learning needs of students. So I believe I have some slides, if Habib could help me get those up so you can see some photos whilst I speak through some of the examples. Thank you so much. Great. So I'll start with some examples of micro innovations that have come through from the human-centered design process in India. And these speak particularly to what Alina was mentioning about equity solutions, particularly over this period of learning loss during the pandemic when schools have been closed. So the India team, they came together to think about how can they reach children and communities where they have different access to different levels of access to technology. And so they thought about a number of solutions that could be reaching parents and students both with some level of access to technology, likely just a smartphone, or for a lot of students that don't have any access to technology. So I'll start you off here. We've got the Learning at Home kit, which was a no-tech solution, and this included many different activities such as puzzles, word cards, and several activity ideas, as well as information about COVID and face masks to raise awareness of the safety aspect of COVID. All the learning materials are aligned to the curriculum, and it was focusing on language, maths, and creativity. A big part of this was also wanting to involve the parents in engaging with the learning of their students, and this proved to be very successful. They got lots of positive feedback from parents who had been actively engaging. These kits were distributed to over 1,000 children and families. This led them to design kits for other age cohorts as well. If we could skip to the next slide, I can show photos of another micro innovation. These were WhatsApp posters. So these were for parents that did have access to technology through a smartphone. And these were simple posters outlining some simple activity ideas for different age groups of students for them to continue their learning at home. And again, involving the parents, so featuring a parental engagement element too, focused on language, maths, science, and arts. And they were designed particularly in mind having the parents would have low levels of literacy. And so they focused a lot on using images and not much text, but also designed keeping in mind that parents would have limited data. So the file size is very small and in the images are in a low resolution. Next, I can speak about the learning wall, and this title here translates to something like riddles. So this is another no-tech solution, fairly simple idea, and it came about because the team had conversed with parents who said that online classes and classes on television are not in our reach due to a lack of devices. So the simple idea was to place a foldable whiteboard on the outside exterior wall of a building within the community, and every day a volunteer would come and write a riddle or a puzzle or a question for everyone in the community to try and solve. So this engaged people from across the community, of course children, but there were a number of older members of the community who also got involved. So this facilitated a lot of community cohesion as well as the problem solving skills. Next, I'll briefly talk about this, the volunteer learning activity centres. These opened in well-ventilated spaces in the school vicinities in India. And there was two parts to this. So it was, of course, the children engaging in their learning outside of school, and they were being guided by youth volunteers. So these were students that may have finished their school studies, and they were onboarded and trained to be facilitators of these learning activity centres. So there was a focus on leadership and civic engagement for the youth, as well as the focus on the core skills for the children. These again were very popular and reached over 700 students via 60 spaces that were running daily. I've got a few examples from Tanzania. Maybe I'll quickly mention them because I know others will want to answer this question. So quickly to show you a few examples, this one is a T-learning kit, which was designed by a pre-primary teacher in Tanzania. She's got over 100 students, and she'd identified that students were struggling with their reading, writing, and arithmetic. So she came up with this simple solution, this T-learning kit, whereby students could practice reading letters and numbers to assist with their early letter and number recognition, and they could play games with it. You can see in the photo they had several kits that they could position around the class, and children without the kits, they had boards and maps for them to participate as a game, and the teacher would sing songs that aligned with the different letters and numbers, so it helped them with their letter and number recognition. As time goes on, they can get to learn how to put these in sequences and learn basic words and number sequences. And again, here's another one. This is for primary and focused specifically on maths and problem solving. It was identified by the teacher because he realized that his students were struggling to break down number solutions. So you can see the various rows and columns here would help the students break down the place values into units, tens, hundreds, and thousands. And so we're focusing on maths, critical thinking, and problem solving. So I'll hand back, but I hope that gives you an idea of some of the micro innovations coming out of Schools 2030 so far.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Ellen. It really does help paint a picture of exactly what this looks like in a school context and in a classroom context. Turning over to you, Kieran, and moving maybe to innovations that happen at the school level and maybe are scaled more broadly. Are there any examples that you have seen in your experience?
Yeah, I can talk about sort of two examples, one being from an organization called Rising Academies and one from Justice Rising. But just before I talk about them, I just want to sort of set the scene, set the context a little bit. So as Alina had mentioned earlier, GSF is a member network of non-state schools, school networks, and school support organizations. And interestingly, Brookings did a report in terms of where innovation is found, what's the most likely organizations to sort of come up with interesting innovations and solve core problems. And it seems to be it's the non-state. So 60% of innovation, school-based innovation, is coming from the non-state. So just to give you an idea of, who are these innovators, what are they doing, etc. And then I'll just talk a little bit about Rising Academies. So Rising Academies' response to COVID-19 was something called Rising on Air, which was really, really interesting because what they did was realize that, the only channel that they can actually deliver education to children remotely, if they don't have access to technological equipment, is through the radio. Although, yes, radio has its problems, it was one of the only delivery channels. And so if they thought about the core problems that radio tends to have and how best they could manage this. And so that was with, providing some sort of SMS content in addition to some radio content. But again, they thought about, what are the kind of core problems that would happen if we tried to scale this? We need to, reach hundreds of thousands of children. What are the kind of core problems and challenges in reaching those children? And one being that children are likely to learn if whatever they're learning fits the context that they're in. So the language is in the same language that their mother tongue, essentially, and there are names and images, etc., that they can align and relate to. So what they did, which was quite innovative, is create sort of radio scripts that were highly adaptable and quickly changeable. And so this was really interesting because then they started talking to government partners, to other non-state partners, and they also found this particularly interesting and were able to scale this innovation over 25 different countries in a very short space of time, approximately sort of 2 years. And I think the reason that they were able to do that is twofold. One, they were able to quickly, they created content that was quickly adaptable, and two, leveraged sort of core networks. So sort of building, so really kind of looking at their partnerships and harnessing that. Since COVID-19, obviously we're post-pandemic, they continue to iterate, they continue to change. And this kind of Rising on Air product has morphed into something called Rory, which is an AI-based tool to help more personalized learning. So kind of picking up on the fact that, learning is a very personal thing and very different for each individual child. And I think that was a kind of core learning from their earlier innovation. And it's interesting that they continually adapt, change, etc., to environments and continuously iterate, which I thought was really, really great. And this is actually one of the innovations that has been integral to the Impact at Scale Labs. It's one of those kind of innovations that has made us really, really think about how we can support other organizations to do this. So the other organization, which was quite interesting, is Justice.
I will, as a colleague, jump in and interrupt you, because I think it's worth shifting gears from the innovations as well to the partnerships that that you mentioned. And I feel like Sadiq and the experience of the British Asian Trust might provide some good context for a different kind of innovation and partnership as well. So Sadiq, what has been your experience?
Yeah, no, thanks. So yeah, as you sort of mentioned, sort of the innovation comes at a organization, operational kind of aligning incentives through the financial mechanisms and the flow. So at the British Asian Trust, we developed what's called the Quality Education India DIB, which launched and was impacted quite like during COVID. So what we kind of saw there by like there was innovation enough to kind of get the program mobilized and engage with non-state actors to kind of deliver learning outcomes for primary school children. But it was kind of really great to see things pivot with a focus on outcomes. So originally when it started, providers are encouraged to kind of innovate and focus on learning outcomes and kind of do what it takes to do so, and results were really good. And then when COVID hit, they had to pivot basically, and because of the strong buy-in from the various actors, so the funders and the strong service providers, instead of kind of deer in headlights, they were all able to adapt to the situation. So, and by that I mean annual targets were reduced to allow a focus on kind of longer term learning gains and keep the DIB true to its purpose. So some of the innovations we were able to see there was kind of trialing digital methods. So service providers shared content via SMS and WhatsApp, even via phone calls. Also, trialing community learning options, so taking some of the kind of classroom best practice but applying it in smaller settings, and also just being able to reach some of the communities with low digital access, which is kind of really important, and also elevating the role and buy-in of caregivers such as parents, community leaders and volunteers. And I think that was a really big learning as a critical group of stakeholders that can be used to drive learning outcomes. I think what we've been really excited to see, I guess, in a sort of odd-ish way, is COVID sort of catalyzing educational, like ed tech providers and solutions in the market. I mean, that was already there a bit in India, but it really boomed, and products were developed at scale and continually adapted to ways to make it kind of more equitable. So tech rollouts, it started with deploying kind of tablets, one per household, and then learning and iterating, learning that sort of it didn't work necessarily as such, and you had to have maybe a couple of tablets. And kind of as Ellen touched on as well, so products had to be redesigned. It was realized that it wasn't necessarily appropriate for some of the cheaper devices and for data packages. So yeah, lots of really great learning. And I think in terms of like because of that development, it's just gathered a lot of interest, and now we're seeing interest in partnerships across sectors, governments taking notice, non-state actors wanting to do more and use government as a channel to access some of the low-income communities. So yeah, some really positive innovations and partnerships that we've seen on the ground.
Really interesting. And I think shifting gears, I think I have a question for John, and we'll see now, which is, do you feel like governments and funders are ready for these innovations and to support them and to themselves grow as innovative organizations? Maybe starting with you, John. What kinds of things should funders and governments have in place to respond to this?
Yeah, thanks. So, I mean, I would start off by saying it's very difficult to argue with innovation, to say, no, we want less innovation. So I think everyone sort of generally agrees innovation is a good thing. I think at the Yakos Foundation, our sort of maybe piece that we add to that is how do we know innovation works? So what is the efficacy side of it? And I think that's where sometimes innovation, we don't think about the problem, and there's this false dichotomy between innovation and measurement, right? So people say I have to move fast, I have to adapt, therefore I can't measure. And I think the traditional funding model, and I speak here kind of the philanthropy / DFI approach is, we're going to fund you. We want to know a very detailed explanation of how you're going to spend your money. And then at the end, give us some numbers around what you've accomplished. And so that is actually a very detailed focus on sort of the inputs and a very loose focus on the results. And actually, we think that's probably backwards. So I think what you need, funders need to have funding that's a bit more flexible, that allows for adaptation to local realities, allows for pivoting adjustments, but then really be very rigorous at the end on what works and what doesn't work. And I give an example on, you asked for some things that we've seen that worked in the pandemic. We supported an organization called Young Love, which does a combination of kind of SMS and phone interventions, and that really took off during the pandemic. And I would say the part that was really, I think, great about what they were doing is that they were able to do remote assessments. So, one of the things in the pandemic is that, you couldn't go do assessments. And so nobody knew whether anything worked or didn't work. So they did remote assessments, and they were able to really show, how their interventions worked or to what degree. And one of the interesting results from Nepal was that, they compared these interventions, whether they're done by NGO facilitators or by state employees. And they show that actually the state employees are just as effective, if not a little more effective than the NGOs. And I think it's an interesting finding where it kind of flies into the face of what people would normally think. And I think that having those kind of measurement frameworks in place allows you to sort of discover interesting things and then ask questions about what doesn't work, and then challenge some of the assumptions people go into. So to sum up, I think funders really need to be thinking much more around the measurement problem. And this false dichotomy, and I hear all the time, you can't do RCTs in EdTech because it takes too long, etc. So we can agree with that, but there are other ways to do robust assessments without doing an RCT. There are ways to pick proxies, but the proxies that have high predictive power versus proxies that have low predictive power, that's an important element that I think funders should be aware of and think about. And funders really set the context, and I think the same can be said for governments, who can also create funding arrangements. And I use that to transition to Wilsina, who I know has been involved from that side.
Thanks, John. I would say a system similar to like what the government of Sierra Leone has done, the Human Capital Development Incubator. There's the Sustainable Development Goals Lab in Oxford, and there's the Go Lab at my school, for example. They have different names, but they have similar functionality. Because what this system does is it minimizes the level of bureaucracy that exists within government. And these layers of bureaucracies make it really difficult, nearly impossible to innovate. And when I refer to innovation here, I'm not saying something groundbreaking, entirely new to this world. In fact, some of the most successful innovations we've seen are those that have been tried and tested in other countries. And when we bring them to our environment, we are intentional about mapping out the processes to ensure we're factoring the context differences and adapting these ideas to our given context. So I think for funders, they need to be more open to unrestricted funding, because one of the beauty about the relationship we had with UBS and the Peter Condell Foundation, which John was a part of UBS at the time, because we had unrestricted funding, we were able to quickly draw on our experience with Ebola and like just revive those structures for distance learning, similar to what was mentioned about the radio, phone calls. We couldn't have done that if the funding was restricted and we couldn't move them around. But from the government side, I think governments need to be intentional to set up such systems to complement the work of the civil servants, the public servants, with emphasis on evaluation. So again, it could be RCTs, it could be DIDs, just something robust that we know we're testing, we're evaluating, and if we decide to scale, it will be based on result. And I think one key caveat to thinking about such a system, especially from the government side, would be that innovation should be addressing real challenges, but it should also be affordable. If we're thinking about sustainability, I remember we had to move from input funding to outcomes funding, where we worked with the Education Outcomes Fund, because it's not sustainable to just keep putting in money and not using like real metrics to see what the results are. And also for the Education Innovation Challenge, one of the components that I appreciated was we had a cap, $25 per student, because no matter how amazing this idea is, if the government can't practically take it on beyond the funding that they're receiving from funders, then it pretty much makes no sense. So I guess in a nutshell, government should start thinking about what system can we set in place that will be separate from the bureaucratic processes, but that is also complementing these bureaucracies. So we're innovating, we're testing, we're learning, and we're scaling.
Thanks a lot, Wasina. And it really, I think Sierra Leone has really paved the way in terms of showing what's possible in innovation. So I'm hearing flexible funding, a strong focus on measurement and evaluation, and the focus on sort of results as opposed to inputs. As well as sustainability, so kind of a keen focus on the cost of innovations and how they can be scaled through the system. Kieran, in your view, how does that translate to things that innovators should then be thinking about? What sort of support do they need to be able to come up with this type of innovation?
Yeah, I guess there's kind of three levels of support. The first is kind of just generally there seems to be a lack of sort of ecosystem buy-in and general support for sort of early stage innovators wanting to scale their innovation. So there's these sort of stages that I think Brookings call the Valley of Death. I mean, they're across various organizations refer to it as the Valley of Death. But in education particularly, there's just a lack of support when it comes to funding and when it comes to guidance. And that, you know, there's just generally ecosystem buy-in is low. Therefore, they'll get to a certain stage and then they can't get through certain stages and then they'll just drop off and then the innovation just sort of fizzles out. But it needs runway to consistently test and iterate to be able to see whether or not it's viable. So there just needs to be sort of more support within those kind of crucial stages, i.e. the Valley of Death stages. Also, I think just kind of echoing what John and Wilsina were saying sort of around evidence, there is large gaps. So there's lots of people doing interesting things, but nobody's being able to demonstrate from an output perspective that this is great and it's not being shared. Therefore, this opportunity for replicability, adaptability doesn't quite yet exist. So I guess it's more of a sort of platform problem. So how do we help these organizations sort of put the evidence together more concretely and then share that? So I guess there's sort of the three areas that need to be sort of looked at.
And I know Schools 2030 has done a lot of work specifically on those questions around the evidence and the diffusion of evidence. Ellen, any specific examples or practices that you found helpful?
Yeah, I think listening to those previous points, a lot of those echo with Schools 2030. And in terms, particularly around the buy-in and the evidencing. And I feel like Schools 2030, maybe we're in quite a privileged position in that we're, you know, a large program working across 10 countries that it's almost like the program itself is an innovation. We're trying to see if this approach works, of introducing human-centered design and putting a lot of the power into the hands of teachers and encouraging a shift in mindset and whether that works. In terms of the evidencing, so we're kind of very much at an early stage in Schools 2030, but the teachers, as part of the human-centered design process, we're really seeing them as action researchers. So they are gathering information, from the outset. We are recognizing that they hold the power, they are the change agents, they know their settings, they know their learners, but we're encouraging them to use data from assessments, and then through testing, reflecting and iterating on their solutions, learning more about what the impact and effect is of these micro innovations on their students. And then we're also approaching this from different angles, whereby we have partners in country who are supporting with the learnings more broadly from the programme, as well as research partners with which I work closely with. Some other points I was going to mention about what, from our experience, we feel that schools need support with in terms of bringing about these innovative practices is definitely kind of this shift in mindset and building teachers with the confidence to know that they have the potential to be creative problem solvers. There's definitely a need for buy-in from leadership within school systems. They also need the tools and mentoring. What we're hearing a lot from our program is that teachers would like more opportunity for peer support and opportunities for collaboration and feedback, both with their peers, but also through engagement with policymakers. And we think for ultimate success, that there needs to be space for dialogue between teachers who are going through this process of human-centered design. They're producing data-led and evidence-led solutions. They need to have a space to be able to showcase that, if you like, to those making policy. That kind of ultimately links to the success and the scaling of potential solutions.
That is such an important point. It would be, if I were to reflect on successful innovation initiatives, I think they always incorporate this platform for sharing learnings. I mean, putting in place the evidence is definitely most important, but then sharing it and creating the forest to share it with policymakers feels very crucial too. Well, Sina, how have you seen that play out in the Education Innovation Challenge? And then Sadiq, also in the innovative financing partnerships that the British Asian Trust has been a part of.
Thanks, Alina. I think just to echo what Ellen was saying, for schools to successfully create and innovate ideas that they're scaling, they need to have the flexibility of coming up with innovative ideas that we can then look at, review, refine, if we think this is something we want to go ahead with. The reason why I say this is, let's think about it practically. No one would know what is best for me like I do. And even if you're convinced that you know what is best for me, give me an opportunity to still make real input to your idea, and then we decide together what we want. And the reason why I say this is, we've seen this in schools. At some point with the implementation in Sierra Leone, we had to re-engage some schools because they felt like this was imposed on them. They were not given the opportunity to be in the driver's seat. So as we think about creating this space for successful innovation, because at the end of the day, one key stakeholder that we need are the teachers, for example. And so if you don't involve them from the start, you don't make them feel like this is something we're doing together, this is something that is beneficial to us all, then there'll be like this, oh, it's their idea, them versus us. And this is also something I learned during my time working with the National Ebola Response Center. We saw millions and millions of dollars poured into the response, but no real change was seen until we engaged the communities and let the local leadership structure guide the response that we developed. So yes, it needs to be evidence-driven. You can't take that away, because that is also a challenge with the education space. It's not like health. I feel sick, I take a pill, I feel better. With education, it's more tricky. It's years and years of investment. So firstly, we need to create that space where even if we are the ones coming up with this groundbreaking idea, we get the stakeholders to feel as involved as possible, so they're happy to run with it. We have that ownership, and then backed by evidence, backed by our openness to see, okay, if this is not working, there's nothing wrong with going back to the drawing board, adapting it, iterating it, and implementing.
Yeah, and just from my perspective, I think I sort of agree with a lot of what has been said. It's all really interesting and pertinent to the work that I'm doing. Results-based financing was started as a way to encourage innovation, and as I sort of touched on, focus on outcomes and allow your service providers to innovate while focusing on the outcomes. I think there's been a shift in the mindset towards wanting to deploy evidence-based interventions, and of course there's a real a role and need for evidence. Some of the change that I don't like is kind of having a lack of evidence used as a barrier or an excuse to doing something, and actually utilizing results-based finance mechanism as a kind of intensive learning lab to build the evidence. So I think that's just been my reflection on the shift, and what it means in this space is kind of and how we've had to factor that in and incorporate it is really change how we're designing programs, and work with people that we trust and are kind of signed up on the same ethos. And by that I mean funders who are flexible, service providers who can innovate and who know how to. I think in a way, by definition, there is a big distance between government or funders and the child, and understanding that innovation happens in the classroom, and trusting your partners and teachers to do the right thing and focus on outcomes is really important. And I think that we should sort of continue to encourage that. My point around kind of changing the design, I think the focus is shifted to making sure that we design for scale, and this kind of comes back to that feedback loop and design programs that are appropriate for governments and funders to really take interest. So we should always have a strong theory of change and a theory of scale as well, about what does it mean after this immediate program is done. Designing DIBs or other results-based programs that are actually adoptable by government after your sort of 4 or 5 years are done. And by that I mean it needs to be something that can be done at scale. It needs to be a relatively cheap per child cost, for example. And I think that all these things need to be factored into design. And I perhaps repeating some of the good points made earlier, but I think investing in early on in robust monitoring and evaluation is like really critical. I think so that just helps us move away from that status quo and proving the point to allow for sort of greater adoption. I think the last point I just wanted to make on this is that innovation is not necessarily just tech and shiny things, and I think that's often what we think, but some of the really interesting areas where we've seen improvements is process innovation. And I think it's quite boring in a way to say, but that could be a really big win for innovation and driving scale, and we should value that through appropriate measurement and mainstreaming.
Thank you very much, Sadiq, and everyone for these very insightful comments. I want to close off the discussion very quickly in 30 seconds. If each of you could tell me, and I think Sadiq, you've touched on this already, but happy for you to summarize again. If you were like minister of the world for one day, what would be the main change you would make to the status quo to ensure that innovation is more effectively leveraged to solve education problems? Starting with you, Ellen.
Sure. So I would elevate the status of teachers and school leaders, allow them the autonomy to make decisions to respond creatively on the best evidence that they know about their students, and put them in a position of dialogue with policymakers.
Thank you, Kieran.
I guess a similar line, but just kind of encouraging more sort of ecosystem buy-in. So looking at how we can support governments to work better with the non-state and vice versa, in addition to sort of how we can bring private implementers into the game as well.
What about John?
Yeah, so two final thoughts. Luckily or unfortunately, there's no minister of the world, but things that we can think about. One is sort of building what I said before, this idea of using instrumental proxies. There needs to be more data around things, the predictive power of various things. So when you see engagement on an app, what does it tell you about learning? The more research we have on that, the more we can then use those engagement variables to sort of measure the success of an intervention. So that's one. The last is sort of government engagement. I'm always surprised. I see a lot of organizations, they're really not thinking about how their model is going to get taken up by government, or they think about it, when I'm done, I'll think about it. Government engagement, even in countries like Sierra Leone, where the minister is very open, it's very difficult. It's a long, and in other countries, it's a long game. It's something you have to start from day one. And you have to have a lot of perseverance and patience. And with the last example I'll leave, now everybody comes with an idea of education in Ukraine. And I'm always amazed, the lack of understanding of or connection to the ministry there. And there was a reform. Some people are not aware that there was an education reform, curricular reform 2 years ago. And so I think just being connected from day one with government in some way, and having a plan to roll that out as an integral part, so not a later on, but an integral part from the very beginning. I think that's one for all people hoping to innovate and scale innovations.
Very good call to action. Sadiq and Lucina, over to you.
Completely agree. I think it's really critical to sort of connect more government and non-state actors. Just following on, I guess, from John's point, where I would sort of go extra is the fragility of some of the systems. I think we've obviously globally felt it with COVID, but there's sort of school closures for kind of a number of reasons. And I think focusing on outcomes, better connecting government and non-state actors can be really, and like at-home learning solutions is a really important thing that I would focus on as Minister of the World, to just kind of ride out some of that uncertainty that will continue for whatever reason disruption might be caused.
Yes, I agree with all what has been said. In addition to that, I will develop a policy around teachers, like making the profession so attractive that we see the brightest and best competing to be teachers, backed by, of course, evidence. So getting to a place where I would want to be a teacher in Sierra Leone because I know the package that is being offered is so attractive, and I have that space to innovate. I have that space to try out new ideas. But of course, there is like this evaluation metrics, just to get to a place where the teaching profession is so competitive, and we know that we're entrusting the brightest and best with the role of educating our children.
That's a wonderful note to end on. And thank you so much. I feel like the world would be a fantastic place with all of you in charge of it. I would like to turn it over now to our audience. Please raise your hand if you had any questions that you wanted to ask. I see. Sorry, it's going to take me a while to find. Yes, Russ, I will. I think, Habib, if you could unmute Russ.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
Amazing. Thanks very much, everyone. That's been really interesting. I'm Ross. I'm also from the Global Schools Forum. I had a question on sort of integrating with government and larger school structures. There's been a lot of talk about flexibility and the importance of testing and adapting, and I suppose agility. But when it comes to scale and integrating with larger system, flexibility is not often a word that's used to describe big government structures. So how do you get that balance between being flexible and also integrating innovations with these large government structures? I suppose it'd be really great to hear from Wilsina in the Sierra Leone context, but also from others.
Thanks, Ross. Yeah, so I guess when I speak about flexibility in the context of scaling, so within Sierra Leone, for example, and Alina and John might know this, well, more or less John, but more Alina, because she's been there. Once you move from the capital city, like every district is different. It's so unique in its own way. And that's where the flexibility comes in. Because as much as you're saying this idea has worked in District A, if you're moving it to District B, there might be rivers to cross, there might be mountains to climb. So you need to think about, okay, we did ABC in this context, we involved teachers, we involved parents, but maybe the level of economic activity in this new district we're going to won't make it practical for parents to be involved, or won't make it practical for us to find that community member who is happy to give their time to just revise, work more broadly with the children. So in that sense, the flexibility would be being aware that every context, even within the same country, might be different. And so you're open to making that tweak, you're open to making those tweaks. But when you think about scalability, if you've decided that this is the way to go, then it becomes really tricky if you're moving things around, even when you think about evaluation. Because if you've done your baseline linked to certain metrics, and along the line, you just keep changing it because you want to be flexible, it will be tricky to map out the processes. So the flexibility comes in when you're thinking about introducing it to a context, but along the way, it's good to, yes, tap into that bureaucratic mindset to ensure you are still mapping the right processes. So when you come back to do your evaluation, you could see those nuances that might have influenced the result that you're seeing.
Thank you, Wilsina. Any other questions from the audience? If you have one, please raise your hand. If not, or post it in the chat. I'll give it a few. It feels like potentially most questions have been answered.
Alina, I could maybe speak a little bit to Ross's question as well.
Go for it.
Just to say, from a Schools 2030 perspective, and like thinking about the way that we're trying to encourage bottom-up innovations, and your question about flexibility, what we're trying to do, what we're seeing and what we're trying to do, again, we're at the beginning of our journey, is to encourage a new approach and a new way of thinking. But it's not about dictating this is the kind of solution that you should be doing in this context, in this context. In each of the countries, there's a level of autonomy in selecting their learning domains, in what the actual innovations are, but it's about providing the tools and scaffolded guides for teachers and leaders and implementers to follow. But that said, we're seeing a lot of variation amongst all the different countries. They're integrating and using the HCD process in different ways. Maybe they're focusing on different stages of the HCD process in more countries than in others. But essentially what we're trying to do is introduce the kind of a core framework and scaffolded tools that offer the stages or the necessary mechanisms to introduce this new way of thinking and to produce innovations, and also link school level actors with policymakers. So I can't comment on how far we've got with that, because we're at the beginning, but that's our aim and our approach at Schools 2030.
Ellen. We have another question from Musa. Please feel free to introduce yourself and ask your question. Musa, can you hear us?
Hello?
Hi.
Hello, how you guys doing?
We're very well. How are you?
I'm good. I'm Musa from Sierra Leone. And your last question you asked, and everyone, if they are minister of the world presently, and what are they going to do? Like Wilsonia's response, because I can talk about Sierra Leone because I'm from Sierra Leone and I live in Sierra Leone. And she brought up a very good idea to make an attractive package, which the brightest always going to be teachers, because like what is common here in Sierra Leone, we could say from the practical is that most teachers and only link back to teaching because they didn't get their dream job, and because you ask most university brightest graduates, they are not hoping to be teachers here because the services provided for teachers are not encouraging for people to hope to become teachers. So, and I hope she, even if she's not the minister of the current education here in Sierra Leone, hope and when she comes back, she implements the idea, to bring this kind of idea to the government so they can help and introduce this system. So the brightest will hope to become teachers because the teaching field is not as good as it's supposed to be. Yeah, and from the defense of their own teachers, they always said, we are not getting the kind of package we're supposed to have. So what do you expect from us? They end up engaging in some kind of things from students and some kind of things. So I think if packages are being given to them, which are very attractive and sometimes mind-blowing, they could change the system and save the educational system at large. I think, and she should be given that opportunity to come and introduce her idea. It's a very good idea because that's the main problem here in our education system. Very main problem. People have been to Sierra Leone can attest to that because I have attended in school through my life here in Sierra Leone. I just graduated yesterday, and I know that for sure. So that's my own contribution towards the meeting here.
Thank you very much. It feels like Wilsina has her first campaign supporter. One final question in the chat from Claire. There was strong discussion around why localization is hard in the session on Wednesday, and it discussed the risk aversion by funders, particularly big donors, which means a struggle to let go of the reins. And it's how do we combat this so that more innovation is decentralized? Flexible funding and unrestricted funding were mentioned a lot throughout this panel. I wonder if anyone has thoughts around how we get there more and what we need to put in place. Maybe starting with you, John.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of linked probably to the earlier question of Ross, which is how do you think about the flexibility of of innovators and then the rigidity of the state, but I could see you could replace state with big donor or donor generally. So I think a lot of these restrictions are kind of built into the governance of these funders, and that's even for philanthropies, but especially for development finance organizations. So I don't think this is something that's going to change from one day to the other. The bigger the funder, the more restrictive it'll be. So this is probably again one of those long game type of battles. But I think as we get more data, especially intermediate data on how things are going, I think that gives people probably a little more comfort around what's working. But I think the proposition is let's just do unrestricted funding. I've seen this movement with Mackenzie Scott. Here's the money, no questions. I don't think that's the mindset that's gonna take off. To be honest, outside of a few limited funders, I think when you remove the restrictions, you have to add in rigor and data, and especially intermediate evaluation. And if you don't do that, I think you won't be able to reduce the restrictions. So I think at a large level, more rigor, more evaluation can take place of the restrictions. But without that first piece, I don't see the restrictions going away. That's how I see from my side.
Yeah, it's a very interesting point. The data can actually pave the way towards more unrestricted funding, or getting closer to that unrestricted funding. Did anyone else want to add anything on that point from the panelists?
If I may add to that, I'll just say, yes, I totally agree with what John is saying. Like, if you're taking out the restriction, then it has to be rigorous data, rigorous evaluation. But also, in addition to that, at least from my experience at TBI, more broadly, once you build credibility, it's easy to ask donors to be more flexible. And so I won't name names, but we have funders now that we've moved from this point of the funding is so restricted that if you want to move £1 around, you have to write an email, you will trigger like this whole bureaucratic system. But the more you build credibility, the more they will be open-minded to be flexible. Again, like John said, it's not like all the flexibility is going to go away, like all the rigidity is going to go away and we're going to be fully unrestricted. But the more you as a government, you as an organization demonstrate that you're credible, you're delivering what you're saying, again, linked to evaluation, then I think we'll begin to see more open-mindedness from donors, because it's a two-way street.
Fantastic, very much agree with that. And data is a stepping stone to build credibility. I think is important. It feels like a good note to end on. I want to thank the panelists and thanks to the audience for listening and asking questions, and for the amazing conversation. I hope our requests are heard, and that we continue to do work that kind of furthers the goals that we mentioned today.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.